Hey, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This event is hosted by the RCMB Early Career Professionals Working Group. My name is Chi Hung, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington and chair of the Communications Committee at the RCMB ECP Working Group. Early career professionals and junior investigators are frequently asked to communicate their work through short presentations. These short talks are exciting ways to disseminate our science. However, they are also one of the most challenging presentations to deliver. For today's event, titled How to Give an Effective Short Scientific Talk, we have the pleasure of hearing from two experts in their fields, whom our moderator will introduce momentarily. The speakers today are known for their abilities to deliver memorable talks and to teach how to do them well. Today's session will be recorded and is moderated by Dr. Beth Middleton, Assistant Professor of Medicine at the University of Utah. Dr. Middleton, I'll let you take over.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Chi. Hi, my name is Beth Middleton, and I'm very excited for this session today. We have developed a few themes that we'll focus on, and our experts, Dr. Jaime Hook and Dr. Karen Ridge, will guide us through. We encourage you all to leave your video on if you'd like, but ask that you please mute yourself. The chat box will be open, so feel free to insert questions there, though all questions will be held till the end. The format of today's session, we'll hear first from Dr. Jaime Hook, followed by Dr. Karen Ridge, and they will share with us their expertise on every topic from, quote, knowing your audience to a selective data presentation to how to carry yourself during in-person presentations. It is my great pleasure to introduce our two guests today. First, Dr. Hook. She completed her medical degree from the University of Wisconsin and then completed both internal medicine residency and her pulmonary critical care fellowship at Columbia. She went on to complete her postdoctoral research in clinical epidemiology and basic science at Columbia, and then began her own research group at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in 2019. Dr. Hook has received numerous awards, including the Joe Ray Wright Award from the ATS RCMB. Her current work focuses on lung infection and understanding new insights into lung biology and utilizes advanced imaging techniques. Say hi, Jaime.
Hi. Thanks, Beth. That was really nice.
And briefly, I'm going to introduce Dr. Ridge before we jump into the presentation. Dr. Ridge is the Ernest S. Baisley Professor of Pulmonary Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. She is both a celebrated scientist and educator and promotes research opportunities from the whole gamut of trainees, including high school students and undergraduates, to pre- and postdoctoral candidates through the NIH T32 training program in lung sciences. Her work focuses on repair mechanisms following lung infection with a particular focus on intermediate filaments and bimentin, one of the many areas in which she is exceptional in delivering a scientific talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
All right. We're honored to have both of you here today. We'll start with Dr. Hook, if you would please share your slides.
Sure. Thanks again for that kind introduction. There we go. All right, so Samantha and I checked it before, so hopefully everybody can see this. Okay, very good. I see some nods. So thanks again for having me. So I'm Jaime, and I've known Beth and Chi for a while. I've gotten to know Karen in the past couple of years, and she is one of the, I just have to say, she's one of the most amazing sponsors of trainees and developing scientists that I know, and she really is incredible and a great resource, I think, at the ATS. So thanks, Karen, for joining us here. And it was really nice to be invited because short talks are something that I think is really important. And to give you some context, I was looking back through our records, and over the past 10 years or so between my trainees and me, we've given 10 oral abstract presentations at ATS meetings. And so I think we have a lot of experience in this area, and hopefully you'll find my comments to be helpful. So I'll start with, why is it important to give an effective short talk? I think there are three considerations here. First, the scientific impact. Effective short talks allow us as scientists to bring attention to our new findings and thus fulfill our professional obligation to share our data with the field and with the public. In addition, I think effective short talks are an opportunity for scientists at all levels to really stand out. For trainees in particular, a good short talk can lead to recognition by leaders in the field that can lead to other things that are really important for career development. So for example, new relationships, collaborations, invitations to visit other institutions, and potentially down the road job offers. And from a practical standpoint, I think an effective short talk is one that respects the time boundaries given by the organizers. And I think this is important for moderators who are trying very hard to make sure that sessions run on time and that all speakers are given enough time. But it's also important from the point of view of speakers, because in order to have some time for Q&A, you have to have a talk that fits into the proper time boundaries. And I'll comment a little bit on Q&A if there's time at the end of this presentation. So I've structured this presentation around 4 major suggestions that I had. I'll get into this in more detail, but my suggestions were to narrow your focus, minimize cognitive switches, make it easy for your audience, and finish strong. And I've organized the presentation around the 7-minute ATS mini symposium that I know some of you will be preparing for next month. So first, narrow your focus. So when I think when we're given the opportunity to present our research, it's basic human nature to want to put your best foot forward and to present as much data as you possibly can to provide a strong story. But in fact, I think when you have a short talk, less is more. And so I really encourage my trainees to narrow down the focus and cut everything ruthlessly that does not contribute exactly to that direct scientific focus. And we start doing that by putting a slide structure together. There are a couple of slides that are really not modifiable, that are obligatory. So for example, everyone's going to have a title, rationale, question and hypothesis slide, a method slide, conclusions, and an acknowledgements. And all of these slides take time. So when you have to then work backwards to say, well, whatever time is left over is going to be the time that's allocated for my data. But when you start actually thinking about how much time that is, it's very little. So a title slide might take as little as 15 seconds, maybe 30 seconds for the rationale, and so on. And by the time you're thinking about a 7-minute ATS talk, now you have less than 4 minutes to talk about your data. And if you want to present that data, for example, in 3 slides, now you're looking at a little over a minute per data slide. And so it becomes, I think, quickly very clear that a speaker must be very focused. So how does one keep to such a tight time schedule? I suggest that all of my trainees write out a script before we give the talk, and then we narrow that script and hone that script over the next couple of weeks as we practice in front of the group and get feedback. I also suggest to people, my trainees, that they store and edit that script on the slides or in a related Word document so that they can easily go back and give that talk again in the future without having to reinvent the wheel. It can be enormously helpful to put that time in at the beginning. So the next topic I wanted to talk about was cognitive switching. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to use these 2 slides, rationale and question hypothesis, as an example. So when I think of cognitive switching, what I'm thinking of is the brain power that it takes to move from one topic to another. And the topic can be as simple as a change of slide. So if somebody's listening and you're talking about a rationale, and then you switch to a new slide where you present the question, there's a momentary transition that has to happen on the part of the listener. And even if that transition might only be 2 seconds, it still pulls your audience away from what you're saying. And if there's any potential interrupter there, for example, if there's a change in format from slide to slide, or if the audience was expecting you to go from your rationale to a specific question and then you went to a different question, now they're going to be kind of stuck on that thought for some time, and you may lose them potentially for the rest of the talk. And so one way we've dealt with that is to take advantage of the ATS widescreen format to consolidate these slides where we can. So for example, we've started putting our rationale on the left side of the slide, including cartoons where we can, and putting our question and our hypothesis on the right side of the slide. So what this does is it allows the listener to go seamlessly from rationale to question all on one slide, and now they're entirely equipped to process and understand the data slides that follow. So I've shown you one example of background question hypothesis, but this can also be done on other slides, like, for example, the data slide. We found that we've actually benefited from cutting out the method slide and applying it to the data slides. And what I mean by that is, the method slide is traditionally provided as its own standalone slide. But as I've listened to more and more talks, I've realized that having the methods separate from the data makes it difficult to have the information that I need at the time that I need to use it. So, for example, I'm listening to the methods without having the context to understand why those methods were used, and I'm looking at the data and might have forgotten what the specific method was. And so again, we've dealt with that by combining it on the same slide and increasing the amount of time per slide. So let me show you an example of how this works. And it brings me to my third suggestion, actually, which is to make things easy for your audience. So this is one example slide that I pulled from my trainee Stephanie Tang's talk at ATS last year. You'll see that the title of the slide is actually a question. This wasn't the question for the whole talk, it was just for this data slide. So she presented her methods on the left side and then went through a narrative so people understand what she did. And then, since we're an imaging lab, she presented her imaging findings in the control condition and paired that right away with the group data. Then she compared that on the same slide again with the experimental condition and then brought in the group data again right away. Finally, she finished by replacing that question slide with the answer. And so the things I want to point out on this slide were that we used animations to keep the audience's focus right where we wanted it to be. We use plain language to help with understanding. So, for example, flu and staff instead of their more technical names. And then we told the audience the conclusion rather than forcing them to come to it on their own. We didn't want anybody to have to do any work. So I'll just wrap up by talking a little bit about the conclusions. So a couple of suggestions for the conclusions were an obvious one to reiterate the main points of your message. Sometimes cartoons can be really helpful here. But then also to set aside some time to actually tell the audience what's new here. So don't just leave them with your findings, but actually tell them how those findings fit into the larger biomedical research landscape. What's novel? What's new about what you've done? Why are you excited about it? And I think that can really increase the impact of what you've shown. So to bring that back to this talk, then, what the suggestions that I've made were to narrow your focus, minimize cognitive switches, make it easy for your audience, and finish strong. And some of the tools we found to be helpful were cartoons in plain language. I didn't have time to get into cartoons very much, but I will mention that when we use them, we try to start with the same cartoon and then carry it through the whole talk so that, again, people don't have to make those switches. They can just appreciate that we're starting with this picture and we're going to build it and modify it as we learn new things that people see on the data slides. And then finally, to animate to keep the attention of the audience. But as a side benefit, it also makes the job easier for the speaker because now you don't have to worry about forgetting what you were going to say because you're prompted by the slide animations. So I'll just wrap up by reminding you of one potential approach that we've found to be useful. And I'll add that over time I've kind of evolved in how I've thought about the question and answer session. Maybe we can talk about this a little bit later in the seminar today. But one suggestion that I've made to my trainees that's really worked out very well was to write out your Q&A before the seminar, and we found that to be enormously helpful as a group. So thank you very much. It was really nice to be invited to participate in the seminar, and I appreciate your listening.
Thanks so much, Jaime. I already learned a ton and have a bunch of questions to ask at the end, but I will hold those, as I mentioned at the beginning of this. Dr. Ridge, if you wouldn't mind starting your presentation.
Can you see my slides? Fantastic. Although I should probably go to slide 1. Okay. So, I love the fact that Jamie's going to completely smoke me on presentations because I think this happens a lot when we're when we're the 10-minute talk behind the keynote speaker, we're like, oh my God, nobody's going to pay attention to me because, you know, I'm the newbie and I just followed the keynote speaker, right? So Jamie, thank you for setting that up perfectly. But really it's about your own confidence. And even when we might be faltering a little bit on our confidence, it's, you know, putting on a mask that says, you know what, I belong here, which you do because you were invited to give this talk. And so I really wanted to touch upon some more basic presentation pointers, just things you already know, but just to remind you. So the first thing Jamie kind of touched upon is that you really have to know your audience, you know the session that you're in. If you are perfectly slated to talk about fibrosis and it's a fibrosis session that deals with basic science and your basic science presenting, then you're in a win-win situation. But too often than not, we end up getting these 10-minute talks that are kind of not right, perfectly placed. But we always want to give junior colleagues or early stage investigators the opportunity to speak. And so you might not have been perfectly slated. And if that's the case, really have an understanding of what are the breadth of the talks that are going to be presented within the grouping that you've been assigned to. So reach out to those chairs and ask them, who are the other speakers? What are the other topics? And really, what is the main focus so that you can tailor your presentation to the audience you anticipate speaking to. And then Jamie already mentioned this, but you need to tell us why should we care about what you're presenting. And so it's okay to, as Jamie already demonstrated, you know, define exactly what the problem is, what the mechanism is, what the question that you're trying to answer, and state that in very clear terms on your slide. I cannot tell you enough that we need to come excited, right? We all know what ATS is like. It's, you know, anywhere between 5 and 7 days, depending upon how torturous you are to yourselves. And you're seeing talks for anywhere between, you know, 4 to 6 hours a day. And if you come and you're the last talk on a Wednesday afternoon, if you're not bringing your A game, I'm probably falling asleep. So wake us all up, right? You know, it's okay to provide some anecdotal information of, you know, this experiment I had to do 17 different times before I actually got it right. It will wake everybody up to be like, wait, what did she have to do? So really take it to another level and make your story a little bit personal, but not to the point of being a distraction, right? So really define what you're trying to say and then make it with a bit of an excitement. I can't tell you enough to keep it simple. Jamie already touched on this in that she said, you know, we didn't use the full scientific name for staff, for example. So if you're going to use an acronym, if you're going to use a jargon, either keep a cheat sheet at the bottom of the slide so your audience can continue to follow along, or introduce that concept very early on. It would be known that most everybody would know what staff in your audience is, but there's always that one off that maybe your audience wouldn't know. So it's okay to give a key at the bottom of the slide. And then keep it simple. I have had the privilege of working with a gentleman by the name of Aaron Shahanover, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry on the ubiquitin proteasome system. And when I first heard him give a talk, I walked away thinking, like, I have no idea what this is about. But when I sat down and actually had a conversation with him, he was able to transmit the essence of what his work was in such simple terms that when I went back and viewed the original talk, I now came to understand the field. So keep it simple, especially with 10-minute talks. You cannot be complex or you won't get the message across. I always like to kind of think of it in terms of you have to be ready for the impossible, right? So go and take advantage of that presenter's room. Go check your slides, make sure they're uploaded before your session is set to begin so that there's no hiccups when you're really ready to come onto stage and present your new data, your new research. I'm really in the essence of saying this is a performance, right? This isn't you standing in front of an audience and reading what your research was about, but that's not the purpose of giving a talk. The purpose of a talk is conveying with excitement and intent what was really meant what significant about the hypothesis that you defined, about the question that you were asking, and how you were able to answer those questions and what it meant to advance the field based on your work. Now, doing that is easier said than done, right? I can tell you one of the very first presentations I gave, I was literally 9 months pregnant. So there was no easy way to take a deep breath and slow my voice down, particularly when contractions started during the talk. But you still have to find a way to keep yourself calm. So find 2 or 3 people in the audience that you either know or don't know, depending upon what's going to keep you calm, and focus on them so that you can keep the talk going. In the hyperlinks that are in the chat session as well are a couple of TED Talks that I have found incredibly useful to go over when our trainees are learning how to give a talk. Because it really kind of gives you the physiology behind giving a talk, how to pace yourself, how to, when you're transitioning to a really important point, lower your voice, speak slower, or raise your voice so that you can capture your audience's attention and command their attention, not just with your voice, but also with your body language as well. I think it's really important, even when you're coming up to the podium, that you don't meekly go. You don't just kind of creep up like as if you don't quite belong there yet. You were selected to give a talk at the ATS conference. So already you've distinguished yourself from other colleagues in the field. So really, as you're walking up while the previous speaker is giving their question and answer sessions, walk up with distinction, right? You belong there. And that body language tells the rest of the audience, like, wow, I better pay attention. She's about to tell me something, or he's about to tell me something. Smile, right? ATS is exhausting. And it's just so much easier to listen to somebody who has a little bit of excitement and joy because they're about to tell you something amazing and they're happy about it, rather than somebody who's, filled with fear and trepidation. And that's where those TED Talks come in, because they really will give you some great examples of how to mask your own anxiety and mask your own, complicated relationship with public speaking so that you can be the best self that you can be. Or maybe sometimes you have to be better than your best self when giving these types of presentations. And smiling is really one of the key factors to that. Also, smiling releases endorphins, and it lowers your anxiety as well. So smile. Speak up. You really have to, this is where you have to know your audience as well. When I'm speaking to graduate students, I know I don't have to really project my voice as much as when I'm speaking to senior faculty. And yeah, I'll go there. Most of the trainees have good hearing and most of the senior faculty don't, right? So know your audience. I doubt that anybody at ATS is only going to have a room filled with 20-something-year-olds. It's going to be a mixed presentation audience. So really use that microphone. And if you're not familiar with using the microphone, then go to the room early if you have that opportunity and ask the AV guy to know how to adjust the microphone to fit your height, your own volume, so that you're not speaking too loud or too soft. And then I think it's really important to use silence. Everybody wants to use the word like or or It's okay to be silent. And it's okay to change the tone of your voice and your body language to get a point across. And to pause before, if you use Jamie's style of slide presentation, before you put up that conclusion, pause for a second. And then you put that final conclusion that's often in a different color. So everybody then is just really capturing, like, that's the conclusion. That's the take-home message. So it's not just your slides that you get to use, but it's your voice, your body language, and the tenor and pace at which you're presenting your slides. Finally, you need to talk to your audience. I know it's a big room. I know we're all trying to point and make sure our pointer is pointing to the things that we want it to point to, but you really need to communicate with the audience. They're there in front of you and you're trying to build a rapport and get feedback. So you can see, if I'm explaining something and it's just all deadpan faces, I know I have to pick up my energy. Or if they're quizzical or really engaged, I know that I'm being an effective communicator. So really look around the entire room so you have a sense of how your presentation is going. And then most importantly, and Jamie touched on this, and I think she did an outstanding job of how to deconstruct a 10-minute talk. So Jamie, kudos to you on that. You cannot give a 20-minute talk or 40-slide talk in the time slot for these short talks. And when you do go over, you will lose respect of your colleagues. And more importantly, you probably won't be invited next year, because everybody takes notes on who was good presenters and who wasn't good presenters, and feeds those back to program committee chairs. So really stay within your lane, and give your audience the opportunity to ask you questions, because that's really the most, I think, important indicator to how well received your data is. And without that ability to have a conversation with your colleagues during the session, I think you're only limiting yourself. So that was my last slide. So thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. Very informative, and lots of take-home points on how to improve and deliver effective talks. Karen, can I ask you a question? You talked about changing your speech. We've all been in those talks where people have rapid fire, spoken way too fast, or it's been completely monotone and not engaging. Do you utilize a certain cadence, or how do you change your pace to keep the audience engaged with you and what you're showing on the slides?
Sure. I think it's important to practice, because for some, it will come very naturally, and for others, it may not. Usually after I show a slide that might be opposite of what I thought my conclusion was supposed to be, I'll pause and let the audience really kind of grasp that. And I'll say something pretty intentional, like, this was a failed experiment. This was the opposite of what we thought was going to happen. And then I just am silent. And so therefore we went on and did the next experiment, right? So I think those are ways to kind of capture attention when we're giving these short talks.
I think it takes a lot of composure and confidence to hold that silence during a talk. Jamie, can I ask you, you mentioned like having a script and practicing, sounds like several iterations in front of a group. What does the group comprise of? And do you ever bring outside people in? Because we all get familiar with our field, and sometimes having an outside opinion might be helpful.
Yeah, good question. So, one thing that Karen said, one of the many things that really resonated with me was when she said that giving a talk is a performance. And I am 100% with that. I think when I first came into the lab, I didn't realize how important those talks are, or what an opportunity they can be if you can do them well. And now as a supervisor or a mentor, I want my trainees to be in a position to really capitalize on that opportunity and really get the absolute most out of their talks that they can, because it does so much for their career development, but it also reflects on our lab, on the quality of what we do here. And so I view every data presentation as as really it's an expression of what we do in the lab every day. And so because of that, we started actually this writing and presentations workshop in our lab, which is an hour every Monday. And it's a dedicated time for people to practice presentations, because we give so many of them. Many of them are local, local pulmonary division seminars or master's program seminars. But some of them are bigger, big ones like these national research conferences. And I usually ask people to start preparing for their research presentations like 4 to 6 weeks before. And it usually starts, it typically begins with the abstract for these bigger talks, because you kind of come in already knowing what you're going to talk about, which makes it easier. But still, it still has to be distilled down and honed. And so we start by coming up with that slide structure and say, okay, what are we going to talk about in this presentation? What are the take-home messages, and how can we start to populate those data slides? And that can help people get a sense of scope. And my experience over and over with people who haven't given a lot of short talks is they're often surprised by how little can be presented in that time frame. And so we will then start by, putting the slides together, and then we start, once the slides are done, I usually will go back and forth with the trainee and also with the group. And our group there's, I think, 7 or 8 of us, and we're a mix of research associates, graduate students, pulmonary fellows, me. And then sometimes, I'll come back to that question about people outside the lab, but it's usually like our kind of close-knit group. And I think because we've done this so much, we have a real sense of trust in our group. Somebody, Sarah, one of the pulmonary fellows in my lab, brought that up recently, that, it's been a very good experience in our lab that people contribute so much to each other's presentations, and everybody is very open to accepting critique and suggestions and feedback, because there's a sense of trust and feeling like the group is invested in each other's success. So I think that helps too, because there has to be a certain level of security, I think, within the group to be able to get good feedback and internalize it and act on it. So we'll typically go through presentations once the slides are made. Then we'll write the script, and then the presenter will give the actual talk, sometimes standing next to the slides as if they were actually at the research seminar, at one or 2 or 3 times to the lab, and then we hone it as we go. And then the expectation is that, when we're at ATS, that person is practicing in their hotel room, so that when you get to the, I still, like, when I stand up in a big venue like at ATS, I mean, I still get like tachycardia. I feel terrible. It's like you look out at the sea of people, and it doesn't matter how many it's incredibly intimidating. And the only way I've found to deal with that is to have practiced over and over and over, and it's become a performance. It's now theater. Now I'm getting up and giving the talk that I've done so many times. I know I'm not going to have a technical issue, because as Karen suggested, this was so important. You've gone to the speaker ready room, and you know that your slides and everything are going to work. And it doesn't matter if your pointer explodes in the middle of the presentation, because you have your animations to back you up and you don't need it. So I found that those kinds of things really help a lot. And I think, along similar lines, I remember when I was first learning to give talks, my mentor, Jahar, told me that the primary purpose of a talk is to entertain. And that really stuck with me, because the expectation is that your science is already top notch. That's why you're there. But nobody in the audience wants to work. Spoon feed what you did, help them understand. And just to very briefly address your question about whether or not other people have kind of weighed in, because we give a lot of local talks, I think we get a lot of suggestions from people in the division, and the talks tend to build on each other, as I'm sure other people have experienced also. So that experience of giving talks on a local level has also helped us hone these presentations as we go.
Thank you so much. There's a couple questions. Chi?
Great. Well, thank you so much for those suggestions. So we have a question from Tada Bentada, and this is a question that will be applicable to many of us in the research world. Do you have any tips for presenters who may not be fluent in English, or for whom English is not their first language?
Sure. You might, the knee-jerk reaction is everybody says, well, then what you need to communicate has to be on your slides even more impactfully. And I would say that's not true. I think everybody, regardless of whether English is their first language or not, has to have very equivalent slides that, as Jaime really nicely demonstrated, really bring the audience, the entire audience, through like, what's the question, what's the hypothesis, what's the method, what's the main message across. Because even if you were a perfect English speaker, there's somebody who might have sneezed over what you had to say, or coughed over what you were trying to say, or whatever it might be. So it's almost as if the slides have to be able to speak for you, and then whatever you're verbally communicating is just the cherry on the top of trying to deliver home that message. But if you know that there's a specific word that, despite your best efforts of trying to say it in a way that is clearly communicated or clearly articulated in the English language, then just let your audience know that. So they're understanding that one word that you might say quite differently is X, Y, or Z. And again, that could be at the bottom of your slide for your audience to follow along for you. And I make that suggestion because although I think I am a pretty clear communicator in the English language, when I first came to this country, I had a very thick Irish brogue and failed all my oral exams, even though I was speaking English, because they didn't understand what I was saying. So, if there's a word or two that despite your best efforts, you don't think is as clear as you want it to be, don't be afraid just to put that at the bottom of the slide so your audience is following along with you.
It's a great tip.
Thank you. And we have a question from Jennifer Wambach. Hope I'm saying your name correctly. And it's for both speakers. Any suggestions for displaying figures with the figure slide format that you suggested? And the question is specifically about we tend to maximize the size of our figure so that it's visible to the audience, but pairing the methods and the results together might result in smaller figures. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts about that?
Sure, I can start. So this is an important question, and I think gets back to the issue of scope. I've seen, we tend to remake all of our figures for our presentations in a way that is easy to understand. That, for example, let's say you have a figure from a paper that you want to put onto your PowerPoint slide. You could just copy and paste it. It's been vetted and peer reviewed. It's obviously a high quality figure. But I don't think it's useful for a talk, because if you think of just your classic bar diagram, your y-axis is going to be oriented at 90 degrees, and it's probably going to have a lot of jargon in it. And so I think it's not as useful to use that figure as it is to remake it in PowerPoint. And when you find that that you're trying to show a lot of figures, you may actually be overdoing it. So it takes, one of the things that my mentor had taught me when I was giving a talk is that everything you show on a slide should be given its own dedicated time and description. And if you find that you're showing multiple figures and not describing each of them in detail, then those multiple figures probably shouldn't be shown. Maybe you could show one of them and replace the others with a couple of bullet points that say what the findings were. But, I think if you find yourself showing multiple figures on a single slide, it might be a red flag that you're trying to do too much.
I think that's the right message. But sometimes we still find ourselves having to put a lot of information on a single slide. And that's where I think if you use animation, you can show the slide with all of its content. And then as you're going from right to left, you would enlarge those different areas of the slide with fly-ins so that your audience can see everything as you move across the slide for each of the different panels or content in the slide. So it takes a little bit of creativity, but in work. So again, the best message, I think Jaime already said, you need to start preparing your slides now for ATS so that you have enough time to make all these adjustments so that you have highly effective slide deck.
That is a very creative solution. I like that. Any other tips and techniques for how to effectively deliver and communicate, dense information into a short amount of data slides?
Particularly if your work is already published and you've been given the wonderful opportunity to highlight your publication, put a QR code that would link to your publication on each slide so that if people are really interested in learning additional information that you wouldn't have had the opportunity to present, then they can go to the QR code. If you're not fortunate enough to already have a publication, and maybe it's a bioarchive, or maybe it's just your lab website, again, you could just put a QR code to your lab website that would provide additional information. Or maybe you're just like, dang, I don't have any of those things, and I'm not going to get that ready in time for ATS. you could simply just put at the bottom of your acknowledgement slides, there's additional information, and I would be happy to discuss this work again, either with a QR code or with linking back to your email or some other contact information. And I keep stressing QR codes because rarely do I ever get the email address written down right when I'm in at ATS, either because I'm too far in the back and my eyes aren't good enough. But if I can use my phone and take a picture, then I can capture whatever that link is, and then follow up on it in the days and weeks after ATS. So I really love QR codes.
Karen, you're always ahead of the game on this stuff. That was such a great idea. It never even occurred to me. And if I could just kind of bring out one of the last things that Karen said, was to say, to recognize, let's say you come up with there's a part of your slides that that kind of begs an additional question that everybody in the room might be thinking of, but you really don't have time to deal with it. You can acknowledge that and say, I recognize this is an issue. I'd be very happy to talk about it at the end of the talk if anybody has any questions, because then people know that, you're aware of that there might be a critique here, or that what you're finding doesn't go in the same direction as the literature, and it gives people an opportunity to then talk about it either in the Q&A, or maybe they'll catch up with you later. Maybe they'll come up and talk to you at the end of the symposium.
Great. And we have a question in the chat from Sam Durfee, and this question is directed to Jamie. Can you describe what you mean by writing out the Q&A ahead of time?
Oh, sure. So this was a new thing that we just started 2 or 3 years ago, but man, has it paid dividends. So it came out of the fact that I'm still a new PI. I started less than 5 years ago, and so I was I felt myself that I was relatively inexperienced. And then I was now having trainees that I was going to be putting in a very public position. And I remember how stressful as a trainee the Q&A was. My whole goal was to just get through the Q&A without doing any damage to myself and my lab and my reputation. But since then, I've totally done a 180 in my perception of the Q&As. And I think Karen kind of spoke to this a little bit earlier also. The Q&A now for me is the best part of the talk, because I think a couple of things. One is that if people ask questions, it's a sign that you gave a good talk. I think Karen mentioned this before, because that means that people understood it. And if they're asking questions so people could ask questions kind of in two directions. One possibility is they're asking you a question that specifically feeds off of what you presented. And that's when you know that you really did a bang up job, because not only did they get it, but they were able to think in a conceptual way to then ask a follow-up question or related question. If they're asking a follow-up question that feels a little bit off in left field, then that's still a mark of success, because it means that you engage the audience enough to be interested. But it may mean that that they might be asking you a question that's more in line with their own experience or their own research. And there's certainly value to that. But it could be a sign that, maybe you could have gotten things across a little bit more clearly. But when I think about the Q&A now, I really like the opportunity to have a back and forth with the audience, because you'll see that people will often, a lot of times I'll see a lot of eyeballs up toward the front of the room, that people are really interested in that back and forth discussion that you can have. And the best way to have that discussion is to prepare for it. And it occurred to me that you can actually prepare for it. And it's not just by being an expert in your field or knowing everything. So what we try to do now is for everyone who's giving a talk, part of the preparation process is to write down as many questions as we can think of that people are going to ask. Things that are obvious, things that are not obvious. And then the next step is to try to answer them. So the trainee will answer them in their own words in a way that they will remember. And then before we go to the meeting, I'll look through that and kind of edit it or hone it if there seems to be something that's not quite on the mark or that, could be done a little bit better. And I think with that approach, my trainees, at least the feedback has been that people feel more prepared to have a good discussion, and they feel less worried, because I think a lot of times anxiety gets in the way of a good kind of back and forth discussion. So if people feel like they're prepared and have thought about these questions and what their answers might be, it can be a kind of a helpful coping mechanism.
So I would just thank you, Jamie. That was wonderful. I would just like to add, try to avoid saying, oh, that was a good question, because that would suggest that somebody else's question wasn't a good question. And even if it wasn't a good question, we're not going to validate, good and bad as speakers. We're just grateful that people are engaging and having interest. So try to avoid that trap. It's also okay to say, I don't understand your question, or that's beyond my knowledge base, or I have a gap in the understanding of that. And you can always reverse it, particularly if it's a senior person asking the question, and say, wow, I don't know about that. What do you think? Right? So it's a conversation. If you have a line of people waiting for you to ask questions, and one particular person is kind of hogging the mic, asking 3, 4 different follow-up questions, just say, wow, you really were engaged with my talk, and I'm really grateful for that. Do you think maybe we could talk afterwards so that we can get to the rest of the question people behind you? So the point that I'm trying to make, not so articulate, is take control of your own Q&A session, because it is yours and it's yours to use. So if you don't want to answer a question or get into a quibble about whether or not, a model system does X, Y, or Z, answer the question politely, and then really engage enough to say, we're ready to move on. And you have to be ready to take control of that, particularly if you have other people waiting to ask you questions.
I could add one thing to that. Karen, you mentioned before the power of kind of pausing. And I thought that was really nice, during the talk. I think that can be applied to the Q&A too. So one thing we found to be helpful is to, when somebody asks a question, before we give an answer, at least I've tried and my trainees have tried to repeat the question back. And that has helped me personally feel like I understand the question, and it confirms to the person who asked it that you understand it. But it also gives you just a couple second delay to kind of put your thoughts together about how you want to answer it. And that little bit of a delay and clarification tactic has been really helpful also.
What do you two think about preparing additional slides specifically to address Q&A?
Absolutely necessary, particularly a schematic that would expound upon one aspect of your research that you may not have had time to really get into because of the shortness of your talk. So I think you need those follow-up slides, but you need to have them at the ready. You can't go back 6 slides or forward 12 slides to find it. So if it's 1 or 2 slides away from where you are, go grab it, but otherwise answer the question with whatever's in presentation mode on your screen.
Great. And I have a quick question for Jamie. One of the talks that I was an audience at that I really enjoyed that you gave was a talk where you showed a live microscopy video of an alveolus, and it was fantastic. It really illustrated the point. And in the back of my mind, I was wondering, what if that video did not play during your presentation? And with something like ATF mini symposium, we only get so many minutes to present our information. And if a technical difficulty occurred, like playing a video, there's not a lot of time for the presenter to react and fix it. Do you have a strategy for how to deal with that if embedding a video, for example, is part of your talk and those became difficult during the talk?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a source of anxiety, I think, for anyone who's ever had images or videos on a PowerPoint on a slide deck. So a couple of strategies we've used are, I think so far, I should not quote when I say this, whenever our slides have looked okay in the speaker ready room, they've typically looked okay during the presentation. But that's not going to be, that may not be the case one day. And so I think as somebody who presents videos frequently, I always try to keep in mind that it can't be the essential part of the talks. Like videos are nice, but you have to be aware that these things might not work sometimes. And so there has to be kind of a backup narrative in your head to say, okay, if the things doesn't work, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time sort of trying to make it work. I'm just going to move on. And I think sometimes one of the biggest hurdles to moving on can be the emotional response that happens when your stuff doesn't work. And if you go in there expecting things to work and you have your talk ready and then all of a sudden it doesn't, if you're kind of in the background prepared for it to not work, you can quickly recover and not be set back by that. And what I have had situations where things don't work, and when that's happened, I've just told people what the video showed and then tried to move on from that to like the bar diagram that shows the group data or whatever.
So in a case like that, while the video is additive, maybe having the main conclusion or the major point that you're trying to carry across should not be carried in that sort of animated.
Yeah, I think that's like risky because you just don't know when things are going to go south.
So true. So true. I was at a meeting last year and none of the speakers' slides loaded. And so the entire thing turned to a Q&A session.
Yeah, I've seen some good talks come out of that. I had one where all of our images were red and green fluorescents, and at the venue, their red light bulb wasn't working. So you just like, you never know, like things happen. And so I'm glad it sounds like you were able to recover from that. So, yeah.
So you guys talked a bit from the presenter perspective and how the audience can be engaged and ask questions. Is there anything like if we're moderating sessions that we can help our presenters entertain the audience?
Oh, I think as moderators, particularly when you have an early stage investigator in your speaker lineup, I think it's important to introduce yourself to the early stage investigator before the session starts. Ask them if there's a question that they think would be appropriate for you as the moderator to ask, particularly if you're not familiar with that area or their work, so that you could at least get the conversation started and give other members of the audience time to come up to the microphone. And I like doing that for early stage investigators in particular, because there's always a hesitation when you're sitting in the audience that, you don't want to pummel an early stage investigator with questions because you just want to be their cheerleader, but at the same time, you want to engage them. So we as moderators, you have the opportunity to break the ice and begin the conversation during Q&A. So I think that's one really important thing to do. And then that speaker knows that they at least have an ally either on stage or nearby while they're giving their talk. So I think anything we can do to really bolster the confidence of ESI presenters and speakers, we should, as a community, provide that opportunity.
That was really nice, Karen, because, on the flip side, I've only been a moderator a couple of times, but I've found I'm actually really nervous also as a new moderator, because I don't want to ask a question that's dumb or something like that. And, no questions are dumb, but, I also feel nervous. And so I feel like this is a nice way to not only support ESIs that are presenting, but also ESIs that are moderating and create those kind of partnerships. That's such a nice suggestion.
There's another question in the chat from Jennifer Wambach. Any tips for the rapid poster symposia? These are usually 1 to 3 minute talks paired with time to walk around the posters. So challenging.
So you can blame me for that format because I'm the one who started that. I love that format actually. And I think that that single slide, which I would advocate it should only be a single slide, is really meant to entice, seduce the audience to come to your poster. So you want to engage with enough interest, but don't give the conclusion away, right? Because you want the conclusion to come from you while you're standing next to your poster. So it's a little bit of enticement, sex appeal, whatever word you want to put with it. And it needs to be a graphic, right? Something that's going to capture my attention. It can't just be words. And that's the time. That is the one slide that you really have to walk up to that microphone and just, bang it. And you have to practice that one slide delivery as well, because you have to have energy and you really need to communicate why it's imperative that the audience come to poster number 73 to learn how they're going to treat the patients and cure them and save them and yada, yada, yada. Jamie, what do you think?
Yeah, that was, it's been neat to see how these sessions have evolved over the last couple of years. I think some of the most effective, 1 slide, 1 minute, 1 to 3 minute presentations I've heard are the ones that are incredibly honed. So, I mean, the 7-minute talk is challenging, but wow, that like 1 to 2 or 3 minute blurb can be in some ways more challenging. But in that situation, I think it's really critical to not give in to that that desire to tell everybody everything. You just can't. And you want to be able to speak slowly. And I think you just have to pick the most critical pieces of information. This is the 1-sentence background. This was the research question. This was our hypothesis. And then, if you follow the kind of, garnering interest format, come to my poster and hear what happened, hear what the answer is, or here's the answer. But it really can't be more than like 3 to 4 sentences, and each sentence has to be short, no commas, no phrases.
Great tips. Well, we only have 2 minutes left before the end of the session. I want to thank you both so much for sharing all these fantastic tips for us. And now as we scramble to start preparing our talks and put on our best faces for the conference, any last words of encouragement for our audience?
Jamie, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm excited to see the talks. I'm very excited to see what you guys have prepared. And, I think it's really important to remember that even if you don't feel like it, you are the expert in the room. Maybe there's one person in the back of the room who knows more than you about that topic, but they're not going to know more than you about specifically what you're presenting. You really and truly are the expert. And everybody else is there because they want to understand. They have an interest. They want to learn. And so I think it's exciting. It's an opportunity, and I know everybody's going to do a really great job. It's fun to see new faces and new talks and new presentations and new science.
Well stated. The only other thing I would tell you is you're the future. So everybody wants to see early stage investigators succeed. And so don't fear the audience, engage. You're there because you're studying something important and we want to hear from you and enjoy it.
Thank you both so much. We really appreciate this. There's a bunch of comments all thanking you as well.
Thank you. We appreciate
Thank you,
everybody's.
Jamie. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Have
See
a
you at
great day,
conference.
everyone. See you in May.